Okay, so this is AP World History, Chapter 2, Early Societies in Southwest Asia and the Indo-European Migration. So before we even start, what you need to know is that looking at Mesopotamia, this is the first river valley civilization. And for the next few weeks, the next few chapters are going to be about river valley civilizations. And these civilizations are pretty much what kind of got everything going, got it started. So the first one, like I said, is going to be Mesopotamia. And it starts with the quest for order. And pretty much this section is just talking to you about how different empires in Mesopotamia rose and fell. So Mesopotamia is the land between the rivers. And if you see in this map right here, here is the land is between, or the rivers is between the Tigris right here and the Euphrates River. So it's known as also as the Fertile Crescent because of the fertility or the abundance of agriculture that these rivers brought to the land. It brought a lot of good agriculture because they were able to use these rivers through irrigation networks that they created. So the Sumerians, as you read in the beginning, these are the dominant people of Mesopotamia. These were the ones that they think pretty much started in this land, which is modern day Iraq. And it really was the Semitic migrants that will come in and pretty much adapt to the Sumerian way of life. So as they're adapting, they're going to create irrigation networks. And what these irrigation networks are going to do is they're going to manipulate the river and allow the river to flow into land in order to create abundant agriculture. The Semitic migrants that you see, they're called Semitic migrants because of the language that they spoke. So today, the Semitic language would be Hebrew, Arabic. Those would be considered Semitic languages as well as Phoenician. But they built the first cities, and these first cities are different than the Neolithic villages because they, as we said before in the last chapter, were more complex. They had centers of political and military authority, which means that there were governments here running the show. And in order to back up the government, you had military power to support them. So, again, just larger, much more complex, much more powerful, not to mention that they also had marketplaces and cultural centers. And the marketplaces became useful because this would be major areas of trade, not only for the people living in the area, but people coming into the area as well. And the cultural part comes along with the worshiping of different deities, different gods. So this is an example of the irrigation that they would use in Mesopotamia. They would be able to, in this way, control the water when they would want it to come in or when they would want it to go out. So like I said, you had the Sumerian city-states that begin to develop, and these have formal governments. And the governments really develop because of internal, external pressures. There's this need to control people and the land. And not in a bad way, and the idea that you want to organize society, you want to organize your city, and because of that, you're going to have a government that is going to get people organized in order to do various community projects to make your city-state successful. So the ziggurat you see here, this is one of the things that they did, one of the projects they organized, and it's essentially a ziggurat is a holy stepped pyramid temple. So the priest or the priestess would go up all the way up these stairs, and at the top there was a temple right here. It's obviously in ruins. The ruins are right here. But they would go in there, and then they would make sacrifices to the gods depending on what they felt was needed for the city-state. As we already mentioned, irrigation systems were created again to support agriculture and urban society. And that's really important because you have to think these people are already depending on farming. So having a well-planned, well-created irrigation system is vital to their livelihood, essentially. And then, of course, you use military forces for protection against neighboring city-states. So this might be how the land of Mesopotamia was set up. They had the rivers, the control of the water of the rivers. They also had trade networks up and down the river as well. So the Sumerian kings, most at the beginning, before they even became kings, in these city-states, most of the city-states were governed by assemblies, by a group of people, usually the wealthy people who made the decisions for society. But when there was a crisis that would arise, these assemblies would select one king, and he would be the one to make the decisions dependent on the crisis. And essentially, what would begin to happen is that they would not let go of their power after the crisis was resolved, and this would create absolute authority in the city state, and hence you would have a king or a monarch who was in control. So this is just an example, a relic of Hammurabi. This is Hammurabi and him talking with one of the deities, and just kind of showing the relationship between whoever was king and the deity was very important. Okay, the first empire that we're going to look at is the Akkadian Empire, and it really starts with Sargon of Akkad. He's the one that forms what we know as an empire today. And of course, we already know he created this empire in Mesopotamia, and the way he gained power was that he actually, through a coup, which a coup is an overthrow of a king or a leader, and he, got this coup together. He overthrew the king, and he took over. And he was able to conquer the land city by city. So the way he was able to keep power was through a personal presence, meaning that he would go from city to city and enforce his rule. And a lot of people didn't like this because as he was moving from city to city, that meant that the cities that he went to, they would have to take care of the king, take care of his army. And it put a lot of strain on the city because they would have to give up their food. They would have to use their money to support the king in the time he was there. Sometimes the king's army would just go on raids and take over the areas, take over the stores or the neighbors that were there. So it wasn't something that a lot of these little cities that were under the Akkadian Empire liked. But the Akkadian Empire lasted for several generations after Sargon, and it weakened due to chronic rebellion in city-states, and mainly because of the way it was run, how it had to have that personal presence. So this is the area we're talking about in terms of the Empire of Sargon. Okay, right near you can see there's an opening into the Mediterranean Sea, but pretty much the area of Iraq. And then this is what they think Sargon, this is the relic probably of Sargon and how he looked. The next empire we're going to talk about is going to be the Babylonian Empire. And the leader of the Babylonian Empire is Hammurabi, and very different from Sargon in terms of ruling. Sargon, he went from place to place to enforce his law, whereas Hammurabi, he stayed in a central area, meaning he stayed in his place. He stayed where he was as king, and what he decided to do was he decided to have deputies go out to these different city-states, and they would kind of watch over the city-states and kind of be his little eyes of the city-states. So deputies control the territories. The other thing that he did that was different from Sargon was that he taxed. But he taxed on a regular basis. So again, unlike Sargon, who would just go into the city-states and take whatever he needed, whether it be money or food, again, different with Hammurabi. Hammurabi, at least the people knew what to expect. At least the people knew, okay, every month we're going to get taxed this month. So it became predictable, and it helped to quell rebellions. This is Hammurabi, a stone statue of Hammurabi. And then this is the Babylonian Empire. So you can tell, compared to the Akkadian Empire was just kind of the center area. The Babylonian Empire extended much further south, closer to Egypt. And then just to give you an idea of what a central government is, this would be as if Hammurabi was in his main area, and then the states outside of him, but they're still connected to that central government. One of the more famous things that Hammurabi came up with was Hammurabi's Law, or Hammurabi's Code. And it was a high standard of behavior. So you can't think of this code as it's just about being strict and giving punishment. Yes, there were certain punishments, but it was the idea that we were trying to keep peace in society. And the only way that we could keep peace is if we have high standards of conduct that we had to abide by. So that's really why Hammurabi's law was put into place to maintain these high standards. And of course, if you didn't follow them, then that's when the stern punishment for violators would come along. It talked about something called lex talionis, or the law of retaliation. And this is the idea of an eye for an eye, where punishments are going to resemble the violation. So, for instance, if you were a farmer and another farmer stole, five bushels of wheat from you, and they found out that he did, then that farmer that stole from you, he would get, 5 bushels of corn taken away from him. But again, it's the idea that the punishment is resembling the crime essentially. However, the code did take into account social standing. And what that means is that if a noble committed a crime against a farmer, then it wouldn't be necessarily that eye for an eye. It would be more that the noble would have to pay a fine. So there was that inequity there. It was a social inequality that existed. Babylon will fall to the Hittites, which are Indo-Europeans, and they'll fall in 1595. And that's just because they just didn't have the right weapons. And in addition to that, it was already becoming a weakened empire because of internal conflict due to certain rebellions that existed. So this is called, right here what you're looking at, this is called a stela. And what this is all of Hammurabi's codes. And he would put them out for people to see so people would know the law and, what would happen if they didn't follow the law. This is placed in a museum. So this is pretty much how tall it was. And then this is a more in-depth visual of what it says. All right, so here are your first 4 discussion questions. 1, what was the difference in rule between Sargon and Hammurabi? 2, why do you think Hammurabi had more success in his administration of his empire than Sargon? 3, the Code of Hammurabi provided the first set of laws that addressed immoral behavior. Why do you think social inequality existed between punishments? And 4, what can you infer about social inequality and power? All right, so pause and take a few moments to answer those questions. So the next empire that we're going to look at is the Assyrian Empire. And the Assyrian Empire extended power to Southwest Asia, and it really came into power because of the weaponry it had. It was far more advanced militarily than the other 2 empires that we talked about. So they used iron weapons in their army. They had similar administrative techniques like those of Hammurabi. And they also followed the laws like those of Hammurabi. And again, you're going to see a lot of this cultural diffusion comes from Babylon, like them preserving Mesopotamian literature, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a relationship between gods and humans. This empire is going to end due to internal and external forces, and that's something that you're going to find out. A lot of almost all empires actually, will end because of internal and external forces. So just keep that in mind. This is the Assyrian Empire. The length of it wasn't as large as the Babylonian, but it did go further into Egypt. And then these were the iron tools of the Assyrians. Again, stronger than the tools of previous empires. The Epic of Gilgamesh is usually how it looks when you see the cover. And then this is artifacts of the actual story of the Epic of Gilgamesh. So the last empire that it talks to you about very quickly is Nebuchadnezzar, the New Babylonian Empire. This empire is also known as the Chaldean Empire. And really what you need to know about this is that it was just kind of like an empire that was wealthy and had really nice, pretty things like defensive walls, palaces, temples. It's going to lose control and it'll be absorbed into foreign empires just because it really didn't have the power, the military power to maintain itself and the people around him. But this is Nebuchadnezzar right here, the leader of the Chaldean Empire. And then this is the area of the Chaldean Empire, the defensive walls that still exist to this day. All right, last question for this section. What does the Epic of Gilgamesh suggest about the society of Mesopotamia? Okay, so your takeaways for this section, they should be one, that government is essential to a civilization. Governments not only, enforce laws, but they also provide a strict moral code of behavior. In addition, they provide for the society through community projects that they accomplish. The other thing you should take away is the idea of a centralized government where you have the king or the leader in one area and he sends out deputies to kind of look over the areas that he's controlling. Next takeaway should be Hammurabi's Code and essentially what that was. Of course, again, this strict high moral code of behavior, but also recognize that there were social inequalities that existed. So it wasn't truly an eye for an eye. It was an eye for an eye if you were equal to each other, but it was a social inequality that existed between the rich and the poor, essentially. And then just lastly, just keep in mind the different empires that we see, like the Akkadian. No, that is the first empire. And then we see Hammurabi with Babylon. And then lastly, the Assyrian. And then, sorry, the very last one would be the Chaldean Empire with Nebuchadnezzar. All right, guys, we'll see you in the next section, the next screencast.